So, are you so tired of getting those phone calls from school talking about your child's behavior? The school kind of at their wits' end of what to do other than ask you to come pick up your child? Well, those challenging behaviors are what we're going to be talking about today. If you were here with us last week, we talked about the importance of changing our lens. So instead of seeing children as, this rambunctious bunch of kids that won't settle down and do work, let's change our lens and let's look at kids in a different light. So instead of saying kids do well if they wanna, we want to be using the lens of kids do well if they can. So if this is resonating with you, I'd love for you to tell us in the comments. Say hi so I can welcome you. I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, and advocate, and I host our weekly The Art of Advocacy show for you each Thursday. So like I said, and I can put the link for last week's show in the notes, but last week we talked about why we need to change that lens. Well, then the next step that we have to do is to really look at the challenging behaviors our kid is showing either at school or at home. And we need to look at what are the skills that the child is lacking in order for them to do well. And so today the focus is going to be on Ross Greene's collaborative proactive solution model. And we're going to be talking about how to identify those lagging skills and unsolved problems. So if you look at what the difference is, because I think when I was first learning about this model, it's like, okay, like I have to get this in my brain. So lagging skills are the why your child is having difficulty. And the lagging skills are what we need to identify because your child needs those skills in order to solve the problems. And then the second part is what are those unsolved problems? And this is the when your child's having difficulty meeting the specific expectations at school, the expectations at home, the expectations at church or in the grocery store. When your child has difficulty meeting those expectations, that's what we call the unsolved problems. And the more we can be specific about who was in the situation when we saw the challenging behavior, the what, the when, the where, those kinds of things are going to be helping us. So Ross Greene has some tools that help parents and teachers identify the lagging skills and unsolved problems. So if you'd like to get a copy of those tools, just type the word tools in the comments. And my IEP bot will ask you to type it again, and then you will get the link to those tools. So I want to welcome everybody that's with us. Yes, so it is a topic that I think we need to spend some more time on, and we need to change some of the ways that our schools and us as parents are being with children and the relationships that we have. So when we look at lagging skills, we're going to talk about some major categories. So executive functioning is one of those areas that typically a lot of our kids will have difficulty with. And executive functioning is more than just being organized and turning your homework in and having an organized backpack or locker. So let's look at some of the other things. If your child is having challenging behavior because they're having difficulty with these types of things, like handling transitions, doing things in a logical order, figuring out how long a task will take. I know my son has a challenge with this. It's like he knows he has a doctor's appointment at 9, but for him to like figure out and plan, what time do I have to get up? What time do I have to leave? All of those kinds of things. If your child's having difficulty thinking about multiple thoughts and ideas at the same time, ignoring those noises that are sometimes just naturally occurring in schools or in other places. If your child's having difficulty thinking before they respond, so are they really, just more impulsive kinds of behavior that you see? Or do they have difficulty trying to come up with other ways of doing things? If your child has those kinds of difficulties, then we're looking at executive functioning skills that we want to teach them. Now, another major category of where kids will have some lagging skills is in the language processing area. So let's look at that. This is if your child would have difficulty expressing their concerns, their needs, their thoughts, not being able to identify when they need a break, maybe even understanding spoken directions, so that auditory input, if they have difficulty processing that, that can be something that we need to focus on to prevent those unsolved problems. Or that social kind of language where we're understanding and following conversations. Is your child engaging with their friends at recess time or in the lunchroom? Is that something that is causing these unsolved problems? There's a couple other major categories. This one talks about the emotion regulation. So if your child has difficulty thinking rationally, managing irritability in more age-appropriate ways, or managing disappointment. So let's stop there for a minute because I feel like I'm kind of going on and on here. So I want to encourage you to chime in. And so we've covered the executive functioning kinds of difficulties that some kids have, and the language processing kinds of skills, and also emotional difficulties. So if you want to identify either, with saying, I see my child having difficulty in these areas, or if you're a teacher or a therapist with us today, if you can think of a student and think of what are some of those behaviors that you see them having a difficulty with, and those then become the skills that we want to target. So let me know. Debbie said tools, yes, and so you should get that message from my bot. And Sarah wants the tools, and Kim wants the tools. So great, that's awesome. As always, I encourage you to type in any questions you have, comments. If you have a particular situation that you want us to use as an example, and then it can be more real life, and you can walk away with like, yes, now I've got some new ideas. So feel free to add your comments and questions right there in our space. So Terry is saying, the problem we hear about most these days is characterized by the special ed teacher as work avoidance, along with executive functioning. Emotion regulation is probably the most critical issue, along with hypervigilance. Yeah, and Terry brings up some excellent points that, a lot of times we will have a conflict with what lens people are using. So sometimes we will see staff, because of their training and their experience, use more of that behavior management kind of lens, and they'll talk about work avoidance without really looking at what are those underlying lagging skills that that student has. And so the other thing is, when we know, and when Terry, because she's a very intuitive and skilled person. When Terry's identifying, we know executive functioning, we know emotion regulation, we know hypervigilance are going to be those 3 areas. And then what we want to do is say, in a specific way, under those areas, what are the identified lagging skills? And I'm sure Terry has identified those. And sometimes then it becomes this like, so we know this, but how do we help advocate for it? And so we shall also talk about that in a little bit. And let's see, Kimberly says, are there specific evaluations we should ask for to assess these areas? And, there are specific things. So if you look at, and that's a great question, Kim, if you look at executive functioning, the brief, BRIEF, it gives then specific ideas of what you can do when you have identified certain problems. And sometimes I think the teachers use the brief, but they don't use the other supporting, tips and strategies that come along with that assessment. So if you would sign consent for it, then I would also say then, once we do it, let's look at some of the strategies that they suggest. And then Kimberly, in the language processing area, a lot of times you'll ask the speech and language therapist to do a pragmatic language assessment, and that taps into more of that social language. But you also want some of the other, more traditional language assessments. And after our broadcast, I can come back and type in some websites, some places that you can go. But so your speech and language therapist can be a really important person on the team. And then the emotion regulation. And I guess, I don't know, and Terry, I'd like you to jump in because I think Terry knows more than I do as far as more trauma-informed based versus behavioral. Because then the other thing I was going to say is the BASC does the emotional part, but I don't know, sometimes I feel like the BASC still has more of that behavior management lens instead of what Ross Greene is looking at. The other, resource I would suggest is to go to Ross Greene's website, and he's got a lot of different information. Yeah, and so Terry was saying that she likes the Vineland, which has been around for decades, and I agree. I think that is still a really good tool. Looking at some adaptive behavior and other areas. Most of these, like the Vineland and the brief, are going to be checklists, and it's helpful to have different people fill it out, because as a parent, you see one thing at home, the teacher or the parent sees something different in the school. And so you want to get a group or several people to fill out something like the Vineland or the brief, so you have different perspectives when you come to meetings. But yeah, and as we go along, Kim, we'll talk about some other tools that you can use. But for sure, the lagging assessment that Ross Greene uses, and that you'll get a link for if you type in the word tools. And then he also has like a one-page guide with it. The other thing I always suggest is that you have a trained person in the collaborative proactive solution model to lead the discussion and to lead that kind of group think time. I am not a trained certified person in Ross Greene's model, but I do want to share it as a resource, because I think it would help so many more kids in schools if we could use a model like his does. Yeah. And see, and that's what I was thinking, right before I said the basket. It's like, yeah, the basket interprets trauma as pathology. So that's where, for a lot of our kids, I think it's kind of a disservice when we use certain tools. And that's why as an advocate, I always suggest to families that before you consent for assessment, you talk about what tools the school is planning on using, and you have a conversation because you're part of the evaluation team. And if you don't think it's going to be an assessment that's going to give you valid results that are going to be really helpful for your child, then don't give consent for that. It's not an all or nothing. And instead, you could bring up alternatives. Like, instead of the BASC, I would like to see the district use the Vineland. And like I said, the Vineland has been around for decades, and I have never seen a school refuse to do that. I mean, that's a instrument that's used quite frequently. So that's the trick, is that when you're assessing some of these lagging skills, you not only want to, rely on some standardized assessments, because the district is going to be wanting to do that, but you also just need to have that conversation and sit down and, sometimes have it in a different room than you typically have IEP meetings in, because you need to be like, this needs to be a conversation, a brainstorming session. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that towards the end of today. And for sure, next week, we're going to focus on what Ross Greene calls Plan B and what we can do there. But it's the tool that you use. It's going to be really important that it actually is going to be helpful for, the team to be able to have that information. So if we look at another category of lagging skills, a lot of them will cluster around cognitive flexibility, being a flexible thinker. And that's one thing that we have to kind of give a prompt to our son, is to remind him to be flexible, because that's a lagging skill he's working on. So these are the kids that, have that hard time seeing shades of gray. Instead, they're that black or white thinker. They would have difficulty with trying to say, well, what if we tried this? Because that's too abstract for them. Some kids might also have difficulty changing routines. We see that a lot with students, or, this was the original plan, and now that it's raining outside, we can't go. And, those kinds of abrupt changes can be very difficult for them to, cope and be able to kind of keep themselves regulated. Or they might have difficulty with overgeneralizing, personalizing things. Like, I think of a student, and it was always like, nobody likes me. You always take their side. You always blame me. I'm the one that always gets in trouble. Those are indicators of your child would be lagging in those skills. And that would be an area that you want to focus on. And then we have social skills, right? I mean, this is like a huge category for our kids. Being able to read faces and those nonverbal cues can be really difficult for a lot of our children. Or knowing how you start a conversation and feel like you can engage, or, at recess asked to be part of a game. Things like that can be, it can be challenging for a lot of students. Having that insight of, this is how my behavior impacts others, understanding how others are perceiving them, those kinds of things can be really tricky. And it's not something that a lot of kids just innately will get. And so that is something that a lot of times we need to look at. So again, if you just joined us, if you want copies of the tools that Ross Greene uses for identifying the lagging skills and unsolved problems, just type the word tools in the comment. So those were lagging skills, but lagging skills are the why we have the challenging behavior. The unsolved problems are when we see it. When do we see that challenging behavior? And again, it's challenging behavior because the child doesn't have the skills to meet those expectations. And again, when you're in the discussion mode of talking about unsolved problems, you want to be as specific as you can with identifying what that situation was. So some examples of unsolved problems that we see are getting our kids out of bed on time in the morning, right? Or if the student has difficulty asking questions in math class when they are confused, or they have a hard time thinking of, what are we going to do at recess when there aren't enough soccer balls and we want to have several soccer games going. And, so these are like just kind of micro examples of what some unsolved problems are that you might see. So then we go back to kind of a question that Kimberly had is like, how do we identify these lagging skills? How do we figure out what they are? And so Ross Greene does have a tool, which some people see, I was going to see if I could bring it up here. Some people see as a checklist, because it's a list of things, but Ross Greene encourages us to not use it as a checklist, but use it as more of a discussion guide. So I just copied a few, just kind of the beginning part of it to show you, but obviously the font is too small to actually, read it. But my IEP bot will give you the link for the tools. So you just write the word in tools. But on the left, you see the lagging skills, and it goes down to, a long list of possible lagging skills. And one of the big things that I think Ross Greene wants us to know is that once we identify a lagging skill, we want to make sure, now it looks like I'm not connected to the camera for some reason. So Ross Greene wants to make sure that once we identify a lagging skill, then we go across to the right-hand column and we talk about when does this happen? What does this look like? And so I've got some other tips here that he shares. As I mentioned before, you want this to be done in a group setting with people who know your child, and to use that certified trainer to lead the discussion, I think, is really important. This is what I was just mentioning. After you check that lagging skill, go over to the right and then describe the unsolved problem. And the thing is, what you might see is you want to have the group share as many examples. So we want to see where it's occurring. Is it just occurring in, the classroom? Is it also occurring in music class, things like that? So you want to get some good specific examples there. And what you want to do is, there may be this one lagging skill, but it may cause a variety of unsolved problems. So that's the other thing is, once you've identified the lagging skill, like having difficulty making transitions, you want to identify as many unsolved problems, as many situations as you can of when the child is having that challenge of transitioning. The other big thing to remember is not to write down the behaviors that you're seeing. Now, this is a big jump from what traditionally we have been taught. So we write down the observable behaviors. Ross Greene's approach is different, and he says, instead of writing like the child screams and swears when he's having trouble, that you just simply write that lagging skill difficulty completing math word problems for homework. So that would be the unsolved problem. So you just want to look on real neutral language, which, like I said, is different than a lot of our teachers have been trained to do. So let's look at some specific examples. And I'm going to look here. So Terry says, our social worker has the Ross Greene tools, but only used them as a checklist. So it hasn't been helpful. Yeah, so that makes a huge difference, right? If it's a discussion guide versus I'm just going to go through here in 5 minutes, check all these things off. So yeah, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a more thoughtful way. And for some reason, my camera is on, but if I try to go back and like show myself, I'm not there. So I'll have to figure that out. So let's look at a specific example. So let's say the lagging skill that we identified is the child is having difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset or shifting from task to another. So then what we want to look at is what are the unsolved problems? Where do we see the child having difficulty with transitions? So I wanted to pause and see if you guys can give us some examples of what, and it doesn't necessarily have to be your child, but what do you think would be some, where, when, what kinds of examples can you share in the comments of what would be some unsolved problems? What does that look like when a kid has a hard time transitioning from one activity to another? So while you type that in the comments, I'm going to refresh my page and see if I get my camera back. So Terry says, getting started doing work in school. Yes. So let me refresh. And you guys. Okay, so I'm back. So what would be some other examples of when kids are having a hard time transitioning from one activity to another? Or like I said, just switching kind of the mindset thing too. So I think about for some students, it's like it's hard for them to transition. And that might look like, that they are just wanting to finish and complete something and make sure it's all done before they get up and go to a new activity. So we might see that as, the student is, having that hard time. And then what we want to look at is we want to make sure that we come from the place of they're having a hard time transitioning because they're lacking the skill, not because they're trying to be annoying, right? And so we always want to keep in mind the lens that we're wearing, because that's going to influence every step of this model as far as the collaborative and the proactive kinds of solutions that we can bring. So, and Laura says, students struggling with language comprehension of if-then statements. If you're done with your work, then you can go to yes. And I mean, how typical is that as far as teachers, parents using if-then? If you get your shoes on, then you can watch a little bit of TV before we leave. And that can be maybe a language processing skill that they're lacking. And therefore, we need to bring in like that speech and language therapist that has that expertise to give us input on the team. Because sometimes we just assume if we're going to set up this if-then board or pictures or whatever, that the child is going to process it and understand it. And that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. So thanks for chiming in. I love when we can get some conversation going ourselves. So let me bring this back up to the broadcast here. Now, another lagging skill that you might see is difficulty doing things in a logical sequence or prescribed order. So I need to tell you that, like, when I first saw this as a lagging skill, I don't know if it's just my kind of rebel personality sometimes, but I don't want our kids to be judged that they're not following this logical order that the teacher set up, and that they have a different way that they can do it, and still, meet the requirements or meet the expectations. So the other caution I would have as a parent and as a teacher is when you're discussing lagging skills and the unsolved problems, think about, is it really a lagging skill of the child, or is it some skill that the teacher needs to develop as far as giving kids permission and allowing for different ways of showing the work or showing what they've learned? So does that make sense to you? Because I think sometimes we get so focused on, this is a skill that the kid is lacking, and therefore I need to teach this and we'll write it in the IEP, versus looking at the environment and the adults in the world, and are there things that they can change in order to help support the student? So from an advocacy point of view, I don't think I would want to go to an IEP meeting and say, well, I think the teacher has some lagging skills, even though I might have thought of that the night before. Instead, what you can do in an advocacy role, when you put that advocacy hat on as a parent, is to say, I think my son has, some areas that we want to make sure that we help him develop, and some skills that we want him to develop. And I think it's only fair that we also look at what support could we provide for the teachers? What support can we provide for the para so they also feel successful? And you can, in the IEP, write in staff training as one of the things that will occur. So that's kind of a sideline, but when we are going through different kinds of discussions about kids and what they're lacking in, I also want us as adults to identify maybe something that we also need to learn. And so Laura has another good point. She says that students with auditory memory challenges also tend to only process the last part of a two-part command. So think of how that would impact somebody if we're giving them, like, if you do this, then this will happen. And sometimes they only hear the then and they don't process if and, oh, I have to do this first. So instead of us using that lens, like, this kid just isn't listening, this kid is avoiding work, this kid just wants to, get attention, those are behavior management, words. And when we're looking at Ross Greene's model of the collaborative proactive solution, he encourages us to instead say, what are those underlying things? Does this child have an auditory memory challenge? Is that what we need to look at? And so the challenge is that we always, the unsolved problem to me is like the tip of the iceberg, and that's what you see. But the the skills and the other supports underneath, that's where we need to be addressing what we're doing at school or what we're doing at home to help support kids. Because if we only keep looking at this observable behavior, and we don't get to the underlying causes, the underlying needs that the child is trying to get met, then that doesn't help us. And it certainly doesn't help, us be in a positive place to support the student. So Terry, I hope that you feel free to comment. And like I said, I think Terry is much more of an expert. And so if there's anything that I'm saying that you disagree with, and this is not only for just Terry, but the rest of you, please type it in the comments, because it's healthy for us to have a discussion. I think when we're looking at doing something that's really so different than how we were raised as kids and the parenting style we saw, it's different for when teachers were in college and what they were learning. We're asking adults to change their behavior to help support kids. But there are times when we're going to have to help support the adult, because we're asking them to do something that is really different, that's foreign, and we can't expect them to do that without some kind of ongoing support. So I think that's always important to kind of keep in the back of our minds too. So, if the child is having difficulty, like with a math process, like with division or something, and there's certain steps, we want to look at, why is that happening? And that is what we want to identify. And so again, we would get into specific situations. And I think the examples that Laura has brought up I'm not showing here, as far as, the if-then statements or the auditory memories, those kinds of things are really important. And Karen says, yes, it's called a lens changer for a reason. And you are absolutely right? It's not only a lens changer, but it's going to be a mindset changer too. So we need to support people with that. And Terry says that she totally agrees. I just wish teachers understood. Yeah, and that's where that professional development training needs to be happening in districts. And like I said, you can write it in the IEP. And I always say to write it, be real specific, but we can get to that too. So today we've talked about using that other set of lens. So I don't know if it shows up well, but the concept here is the children in the background. Sometimes we see kids as being scattered. We say they're hyperactive. We put on all kinds of labels. If we would put this other new glasses on and had that change lens feeling and mentality, then we would see that kids do well, right? If they can. We want to stop that thinking of kids do well if they wanna. And when we talk about stopping that, that means that we're going to stop thinking that we can motivate a kid to do something. I know I've been in IEP meetings where they talk about, well, what kind of rewards are we using? And do we need to change the rewards? They're no longer motivating. And, does a child want a physical, reward, like a toy or something? Or would they like to have time with the teacher for lunch or do something, different? And, one of the things that really bothers me when people in IEP meetings suggest that a child has to earn extra privilege of having time with an adult person who they feel a connection with at school, I think we're really doing such a disservice So please, if you are staff or if you are parents listening to this live or on the replay, please do not put in any kind of, goal or strategy in an IEP that a child would have to earn time to be with somebody as their reward. What we are setting kids up to do is to think that acceptance, belonging, love are all conditional. You have to show me you're a good kid before you can be with your favorite person at school. That is just like, that is not something that we want to do. So when we take away that behavior management lens, and when we take away that lens like, oh, if we just could motivate the kid, he would do better, and instead have that lens of kids do well if they can, we will see such huge changes in our kids and their self-concept, their ability to be self-confident at school. It's just pretty incredible, the changes that you'll see. So, just to review, we talked about lagging skills, which are the why kids are having difficulty. We talked about unsolved problems of when a child is having difficulty meeting the expectations of that specific situation. And we also talked about identifying lagging skills and unsolved problems. And one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we want this to be a discussion. We don't want the assessment used as a checklist where one person just quickly goes through and starts checking things off. So next week, we're going to continue our discussion of the collaborative proactive solution model, the CPS model from Dr. Ross Greene, and we're going to be talking about Plan B. Plan A, I'll reference to, that's typically what we've kind of grown up doing. Plan B is something that we want to change to, and we'll go into that. And then there's also even a Plan C that we'll mention next week. But those are things that we'll be following up with. This is the third video in our series, and I can, like I said, I can go back and give you the link for last week's where we talked about that lens changer. And let me see if you guys have any other questions or comments. So Robin says, I'm a parent and I'm currently dealing with this issue with my kiddo who has anxiety, ADHD, and sensory. So this is helping me understand he struggles with a lot of what you've been talking about. And so she says, thank you. Yeah, Robin, and I'll also look at, I can also send you the link to the show notes from last week, because what I do is like each Tuesday I send out an email and there's show notes from the previous video, and it talks about kind of the key takeaways, and I give you a timestamp, like you can fast forward to the video to hear this, specific part again. I give quotes from the video that can be helpful in other resources. So if you also want the show notes for this, you can just type in show notes, and I can get with you and we can make sure that you get copies of those too. So Robin says, this is how the CLC teachers are. Kiddos always have to earn. Yeah, and that's from that behavior management standpoint. And unfortunately, things don't always get solved with that lens that we wear. And especially with kids that have multiple, challenges, and all the different categories that we talked about. The other thing, and we'll talk about this next week with the Plan B, is you also probably will have to prioritize what lagging skills you want to identify as, let's make sure we're helping and supporting and helping them get this skill. Because, if you have quite a few identified, and like I said, we'll talk more next week, but there's ways of do we pinpoint the one that would be the easiest to change right now and get a win? Do we look at the one that's the most serious, that's really causing the most kinds of challenges and unsolved problems? So we'll talk about that. Yeah. So Robin says thank you, and that she would like the show notes. So Robin, yeah, I'll message you after the show, and we'll talk about making sure you get that. And Karen says thank you. So I appreciate you guys. I love when we can have conversations and just kind of keep that dialogue going. Feel free to share this video with other friends that you think would benefit from it. And I hope that you will all be back next week, Thursday. Sarah has a question. She says, how would you suggest addressing the need for further staff training, specifically if they feel they are already well trained and yet there are ongoing issues with behavior and the ability to identify the antecedents? So that's a great question, Sarah. And, it's a topic for the IEP team, because you hopefully at the end of the discussion will have consensus to provide training, and then you want that written in the IEP so the school is accountable. I always try to think about, I don't want teachers feeling defensive, like I'm saying, well, if you just knew more, or, if you were with it and understood this, that's not going to be an approach that's going to be, very open and received very well. And so instead, I say things like, as a parent, I didn't have all this training when my son was born, and I didn't know exactly what to do. And so I looked for, other parents that had been through it. I looked, for books. I looked all kinds of different resources. I think as a parent, we want to feel like we're being successful with our kids. So we do look at, sometimes for outside help. And just like as teachers, you want to feel successful and you want to feel like what you're doing is really working. And so as a parent, I would love to see the district prioritize more professional development and staff support, and have a conversation as much as you can. If you can get the teachers to come up with some ways that training can happen, then they have more ownership in the idea and it will probably be implemented. From an advocate standpoint, I always think it's really helpful to be specific, because if you just write staff training on, collaborative, proactive solution model, they could give a handout to the teachers and say, we did our training. And we know from research that not only do teachers need, or everybody really, when they're learning new things, they need the information. It really makes a difference if they can see that being modeled. It also makes a huge difference if there is some peer coaching. So it's not just, bring in a consultant for the day, but it really has to be ongoing collaboration, ongoing coaching, in order for new things to be implemented in the classroom. So I'd be happy to, talk even some more with you, Sarah. And, if there's some specific things that we can kind of brainstorm for your situation, let us know. And, we can certainly set up a time to talk. I'd be happy to even individualize that, that piece about how we get that to happen. Because, yeah, I mean, we want teachers to be successful. We want our kids to be successful. And when we're asking people to change their behavior and look through a different lens, we can't assume that that's going to happen without ongoing support to make that happen, right? So, another thing that you can suggest is there's podcasts, there's videos that Dr. Greene has done. And so I always say, just like our kids learn in different ways, teachers learn in different ways. And so even while you're waiting for the IEP to happen, or the IEP meeting to happen, you can start, talking to the teacher and saying, I don't know, would you prefer some podcasts that you can listen to on the way home from work? Would you rather me share some articles? But see if you can get the teachers buy-in that they want to receive some other information, and then get the teacher's choice about how they want to receive that. So hopefully that helps. Sarah says, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Sure. I mean, that's why I'm here, right? And that's why, even though I retired from teaching, it was like, I can't not continue to help kids, and I can do that in a different way. So I appreciate all of you. I know that sometimes it can be kind of overwhelming and, just kind of take over our lives. But I hope that you also are feeling support, and I am happy to talk to people individually, because I want to make sure that your kids are happy, safe, and learning every day at school. So until next Thursday, you guys take care. Find somebody you love and give them a big hug, and we shall see you in a week. Bye-bye.